Hi, I'm Greg Villalobos. I'm a photographer and filmmaker from the northeast of England. I've been making adventure films for over 10 years now. And this chapter of my career, I am brand director at Adventure Spec.
Welcome to the Real Riders Podcast, a podcast about filmmaking motorcyclists and motorcycling filmmakers. My name's Simon Josie, and if this is your first time here, welcome and thanks for listening. So, any listeners already familiar with this podcast will know the name Greg Villalobos. He has been referenced by a number of my guests, including Thomas Hansen, way back on episode 1. I met Greg briefly at last year's Lightweight Adventure Festival in the UK, and there's always been a plan to get him on the podcast, but only after I'd done the necessary research on his back catalogue. What follows is another long interview, but I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed preparing for it and then recording the interview with Greg. During the interview, Greg made lots of references to various filmmakers, photographers, and YouTube channels. I've detailed all of those references in the show notes, plus I've also provided a link to a short YouTube video by someone called Engineerguy titled How A Film Projector Works. I think it provides an excellent visual explanation about analog film projectors and naturally goes into a bit more depth than Greg and I did. If you have even the slightest interest in this old technology, I recommend you look at it. It's really fascinating. Before we get to my chat with Greg, let me remind you that the podcast has an account on Instagram where you will find, amongst other things, trailers for each new episode. And if you want to know what I've been watching recently, follow the Real Riders account on Blue Sky. Links for both the Instagram and Blue Sky accounts are in the show notes. Finally, if you have the time and inclination, please consider rating or liking the Real Riders podcast in your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. This will help other listeners find the podcast. Righto, let's get to my talk with Greg. Welcome to the podcast, Greg. Thanks for joining me on the show today. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. I'm surviving.
Okay, very good. I believe it's half term there in the UK at the moment. Is that right?
Yeah, it was half term next week. And I actually booked this podcast today because I thought the kids would still be at school, but they're actually not at school today. But they have been ushered out of the house, so we have some quiet time.
Okay, super. So as you mentioned in your intro at the top of the show, you're both a photographer and a filmmaker. And I thought I'd like to kick things off with a fairly heavy question today. In your experience, is there any tension between these two artistic pursuits?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The short answer is yes. From a practical perspective, on the ground, the tension is very much, if I'm on a ride and I'm documenting that ride for a reason to make some media on the back of it, I have in my hand a camera that will shoot very good photos and it will also shoot very good film. To get into the headspace of one and the other, I have found almost impossible. So I make a decision, I'm going to shoot photos. And the film aspect of it, I use a different camera, GoPro, just because it's very, very simple and easy. But the dream scenario, which is actually fortunately what I had on the last trip I did, is to have someone whose only job is to shoot video and someone whose only job is to shoot photos. And that is more expensive. But from my perspective, if you're going to do this properly, that's what you need. That's like the answer from a practical sense. From the other side, in terms of like absorbing and enjoying the end product, that's a weird one, isn't it? You know, like I don't sit down in the evening and flick through photo books. I sit down and flick through YouTube, you know. So video has a very strong place in terms of media consumption that is easy, kind of mindless. I just want to take my mind off things. If I am out on being a culture vulture and visiting another city and I want to go and enjoy looking at something, I don't go to the cinema. I'll go to art gallery and look at photos on a wall, you know? um, so they've both got their place. They're just different places for me, you know? And then also you've got the bigger, deeper question is about what's more important. You can never tell the truth because it's always from a perspective, but a video is closer to the truth in terms of I have filmed this 3-minute thing that happened and I'm now playing it and you watch it in real time, as opposed to I've captured something at 1/250th of a second. You don't know what happened before that and you don't know what happened after it. So it's less true in that respect. However, I find that it allows me to project my own meaning and thoughts and emotions onto that still image. And that for me is where I'm at right now. And that's what I really enjoy. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. But I was also wondering in terms of kind of like the mental preparation before you make a film and the mental preparation before you do a photo shoot. And I was thinking, or I was wondering whether one is more taxing than the other. Because if you're going to make a film, you've got to consider a multitude of images, whereas you could be a little bit lazy as a photographer, and feel free to attack me on this point, but you could go out, take one shot, and it just might happen to be a masterpiece, you know? But you're unlikely to achieve that with one simple shot as a filmmaker. And so beforehand, you've got to be a lot very deliberate about what you're going to do and how you're going to capture it.
Yeah, I mean, such a big question. Like, if I know that I'm going to make a film, I will spend time sometimes literally storyboarding, but at the very least, I will come up with the concept of a narrative arc. This is going to be the beginning, this is going to be the middle, and this is likely to be the end. If it's documentary, you don't know exactly, but you can still control it to a certain extent. And then that gives you direction about what to shoot on the way. So, you know, the starting point's fairly easy because it's the first thing that happens. The middle bit is the journey, for me anyway, is like the traveling bit and capturing anything that happens that was unexpected. And then the end is kind of what you learn from it. And you kind of, that's broadly speaking. And so you kind of know what can I capture along the way that is going to fit into those broadly speaking like chapters. And then you can sit down and define it even more. You know, oh, okay, we're going to get a ferry. So I need a shot of getting on the ferry. It would be great if that shot was composed so that the ferry is on the right and the bikes are on the left, because you read from left to right. So showing vehicles going from left to right gives you the sense of moving forwards, and showing vehicles going from right to left gives you the sense of going backwards, you know. So there's little things like that that help kind of cue it up. In terms of photography, I mean, it's kind of the same preparation, but I think photography gives you the room to be, especially if the approach is documentary based, it gives you the more room to be more spontaneous, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to come back to some of those themes a little bit later, but now that, you know, I knocked the wind out of you maybe to start with, so we'll ease back into it now.
No, it's all good. I enjoy it.
So how did you get into filmmaking? And, you know, how did you learn your craft?
I'll try and do this in a concise way. Like everyone, watch a lot of movies when you're a kid. You know what I mean? I remember just sitting on the floor having sleepovers with friends and having VHS. And I remember watching, like, my memories of Star Wars as a child was not in the cinema, but it was on VHS. And I can remember the adverts, because it was always on at Christmas, skipping through the adverts for like half-price sofas, which is like, that'll resonate with some people. Some people were like, what are you talking about? But anyway, so like most people, that's where it started, a real love for films. And my dad really enjoyed movies. When I went to a ridiculous boarding school, and it was a very, very privileged education. It was hard worked for by my mum and dad. But while I was there, they had a cinema that was run by the boys. And I don't know if you've ever seen Cinema Paradiso, but it was essentially a Cinema Paradiso-esque cinema in the school theatre. So we had two huge 35mm projectors in the projection booth. And there were 5 boys that ran that, one boy from each year from 13 to 18. It was called The Box. And I joined it when I was 13. And when you do all of the junior roles, and then you end up being in charge by the time you're 18 and about to leave. And so you learn the craft of actually physically handling film that's projected. And like every Saturday and Sunday, we would have film screenings. I remember like all sorts, like Pulp Fiction, Schindler's List, kind of that. So basically I left school in 1998. So you're talking from 93 to 98. I was busy learning the craft of projecting films. And if you've never been in one of those spaces, you'd be amazed. You've got these 2 huge, great big machines. First of all, there's no light bulb in those projectors. The way the light, because it's so bright, so much light is required. Essentially, you have 2 carbon arcs that are always about half an inch away from each other, and you put an insane amount of electricity through those carbon arcs, and the electricity arcs, carbon rods, sorry, and it jumps from one, so a bit like when you see a welder. And so basically you've got this like huge burning light inside the back of these projectors, and that creates the light that bounces off the mirror and then is projected out of the front. And in our machine, the timers were broken. So the whole of the first year of your apprenticeship, for the whole film, you were in the box looking through a little window and basically turning these little knobs to keep the carbon rods close to each other because they burn away from each other. And so like occasionally you'd get bored or whatever, and then all of the guys watching the film would be like shouting, "Oh, it's getting too dark," and you'd have to run back in and like turn the knobs so that the rods come closer together. And then understanding that a 2-hour film exists in 20-minute reels. Reel wise. Okay. But yeah, 20-minute reels. And so the night before, you're prepping these reels because they come off from a big multiplex, which is on a big, they splice all those reels onto one big one and just hit go. Whereas on ours, you only have the ability to show 20 minutes at a time. And that's why you need 2 projectors. And, some of your listeners will remember those little circles in the top right-hand corner. And they are basically cues. You have your first one, which means start the motor running on the other machine. And then the second one is changeover. And at that point, you let the light through, you switch the sound over. And if you do it perfectly, no one notices. But actually, if you go back and remember that, there's every 20 minutes, there'd be a little and then it would keep going.
I remember that because the little theatre in my hometown when I was growing up, I mean, that was the technology. And after a while, I realised what was going on because one of the projectors was a lot brighter than the other one. And so you'd have this lovely picture and then you go, oh, shit, and it would change to the next one and it would be completely like dull as.
So they needed to change their mirror. The mirror was probably why that was dark. But anyway, so basically my intro was like physically touching, Pulp Fiction, like literally holding the frames, and in my hand as we're prepping stuff. I'm really enjoying the physicality aspect of it. And then, long story short, I went to St. Martin's Art College after that, which is an art college in London. And I studied a degree called Arts and Design. And my kind of graduating project in there was all about, again, the physicality of film. It's no good for your podcast listeners, but I've kind of got them behind me. I built pinhole cameras, 360-degree pinhole cameras using 120 slide film and piercing a hole through the slide film. So it's almost impossible to explain without showing you. But making these like beautiful pinhole panoramic images. And so again, that was all in the physical aspect of it. And like up to that point, during art college, I experimented a bit with filmmaking. And then, actually, it was maybe while I was at art college, I saw an ad in while I was in London, I saw an ad in the local paper for a local film studio trying to raise money for something. And I got in touch with them and I said, I haven't got any money to give you, but I'll come and work for free. And so I kind of became a runner for them. And they were doing a lot of kind of charity, kind of working with kind of kids from disadvantaged backgrounds in the East End of London. And so I started kind of really getting involved in that and going out with film cameras and chatting to kids in workshops and microphones and all sorts. And then I graduated, and then I started freelancing, and I was based in the East End of London on a studio. And long story short, me and a friend started a company called Bold Creative. And we basically expanded on what I've just said. And we did a lot of work for broadcasters and charities and government organizations where they needed to engage in kids. But this was before YouTube, like we were making films that we were distributing on DVDs, like on street corners. So I was learning my craft in terms of like talking to strangers and interviewing people during that period. And the real kind of breakthrough was we got commissioned to make a film, and none of the kids wanted to be on camera, but they were happy to talk. And so we recorded all these conversations, and then hired animators to bring those conversations to life and create animations. And then once you get into that experience, you're not like bound by reality. So if you're making an animation, you can, if you've got like two people and one person is bullying another person, you can physically make one person big and physically make the other person small in the animation. So that was quite creative, and we got a lot of traction, and we ended up doing some stuff like that for the BBC and Nickelodeon, and kind of won awards on the back of that. And that was like a real highlight of that period. And then I met Georgia, got married. We wanted to have a different kind of life. So we moved out of London, moved up to the Northeast, and then started, I got my adventure motorcycle, my KTM 450 XE, and started riding for fun. Because by the end of my kind of working career at that point, I wasn't really doing a lot of the work. I was directing. So I had other people going out with the cameras and animators and all the rest of it. And I realized I really missed holding a camera and being more physically involved. So when we moved back up here, I started trail riding, adventure riding, and taking a camera out again and making stuff for fun. And then starting to kind of document my experience of being in a new place on an adventure bike. It was difficult when I left London, and this was my therapy period, if that's kind of how you can describe it. So, but I was fully invested and really kind of, I was doing some other work stuff as well. I was retraining as a carpenter, but I was very alive at that point. And, I look back on that media, it wasn't very professional, but there was a lot of energy and experimentation and enjoying being back in charge of like what was in my hand again, And then essentially from that point, that was the last 10, 15 years of my life up to this point, basically operating in the adventure motorcycle sector, creating media.
I know I wasn't going to talk too much about motorcycles because it's not really my lane. People may have noticed already. But had you been into motorcycles in any form or in any way before you moved back up north?
I was not kind of brought up with a spanner in my hand in any way whatsoever. I was taken to art galleries and concerts, not racetracks and whatever, So my first bike was when I was in London. I had a SV650. I had a scooter before that, but the first proper bike was an SV650. So I had that getting around London. And then I had a Triumph Scrambler 900 in London just before the whole kind of, I left just before Bike Shed opened in London. So before the whole custom scene started. And then came up here and essentially had this like fake off-road bike. And I was seeing guys riding plastic bikes covered in mud, driving down the high street. And I was like, man, that looks amazing. I want some of that. And then, I've got a whole other story about how I ended up on the KTM 450, but that'll probably sink another half hour of this. So maybe we save that for another time. But yeah.
I guess one thing I was kind of interested in exploring was, it's almost like the off-road thing, you found this new thing, you found this best new hobby, and you're so excited about it. What do I do? Naturally, I've got to film this because I kind of want to share my joy of discovering this.
It absolutely was. And it kind of coincided with the early days of social media, where it really, at that period, it really was a celebration of the thing that you're into. It wasn't about like the algorithm and trying to do something that worked. Like, it was a totally different space. And let's not bore everyone with like reminiscing about the good old days of social media and how it's changed, But, if I was doing it now, I would be much more aware of what I was putting on socials and the brand of myself that I was making. And I might even choose to just not put anything on there at all if I was doing that now, because it's a very different space. But at that time, it felt exciting and it felt a bit more honest, if that's the right way to describe it. Not that anything's purely honest, but it didn't feel the way it does now.
Yeah, it's okay, Greg. We all went through that period, and we maybe some things that we'd like to permanently delete. So it looks to me like you sort of established the YouTube channel around about August 2016, just going by what's posted there and the dates that things have been posted. And one of the first things that appeared there was the film Finding Grandma. I hesitate to say this now. Would you like to briefly describe the film? I don't know if that's possible, but would you like to briefly? I mean, it's only a 7-8 minute long film, so you can't say that much about it. But maybe briefly describe it and how it came about.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. Like, I've only just triggered as you're saying this that you're like talking to me in terms of like, oh, Greg's got a YouTube channel, because I kind of don't really see it like that anymore, because my head's so much in my work that I do with Adventure Spec now that you're kind of talking about a chapter of my career that is in the past, as it were, may become live again at some point. But in relation to that, Finding Grandma, in a nutshell, it's a film about myself and my wife, Georgia. It was our honeymoon, actually, traveling around South America to try and explore my roots and get a better understanding of where I came from, and really where my dad came from, because my dad's from Peru and he'd lost contact with his family. And so I was brought up with this mysterious kind of heritage that was only vaguely talked about. Like, dad's like, yeah, I used to have a pet anteater, and yeah, on the weekends Uncle Maximo would take us out into the jungle to shoot parrots. And you're like, what? Totally crazy stories, but not many of them, because it was a chapter of my dad's life that he just shut and didn't really want to reopen. So we went to South America. Both Georgia and I were really kind of into kind of outdoor stuff, and the idea of cycling was great. So it was like, can we have this big adventure and cycle around South America? So we went through Peru, Chile, and Argentina over 3 months, and several thousand kilometers of cycling across like Pan American Highway and up and over the Andes. And yeah, it was wonderful. It was great. And I don't know. I don't know if I should spoil it if people want to go and watch the film, but there's a really nice little twist at the end, which was fully unexpected. And if you want me to talk about it, I will. That's fine. But it was lovely the way that film ended.
Let's save the surprise for people, because it is lovely. But what I did want to ask, I mean, I'll put a link in the show notes so people can go and find it directly. It's easy to find. But I wanted to ask, did you know you were going to make a film, or have any concept of what that film was going to be when you jumped on the plane?
If I'd known that, I would have taken a much better camera. That whole thing was done on at the time, probably new, but it was an Olympus Tough, like waterproof camera, Yep. I don't even know what the frame size is or recording details, but not very good.
But it doesn't matter. And I think that's one of the most important things. And one of the things I took from that film is that, and actually even the trip that you did from basically Newcastle down to London and back up again on the Green Lanes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's posted at 720, but this is what bothers me a little bit sometimes, that, and even some of my guests have said, if it's not 4K, forget about it.
Yeah.
Actually, it doesn't need to be. If you're making a film, if there's story there, if it's well cut, you can watch a 360p film and forget about the quality if it's compelling. And I would say definitely Finding Grandma is compelling. So, yeah, I hope people do go and watch it if they haven't seen it already.
It's interesting because it uses photos in there as well, which I stopped doing and then came back to, but I was, that journey, I was just documenting it as a tourist, I've got this little camera in my hand, snap, 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 snap. But then, yeah, like you say, it was time to basically, I might put this together as a film. What have I got to play with, So
Yeah. Well, I mean, actually, that was another thing I was going to mention is that if you watch it, it's actually largely a series of still photos. There's relatively few video sequences, or that was. I mean, I haven't watched for a couple of weeks now, but that was one of the things that registered with me immediately. Yeah.
And if you want to get deep about it, the words out of your mouth was a series of still photos, and that is my experience of being in the projection booth. You hold a film in your hand, and you realize it's 24 frames a second on a foot of celluloid on a 20-minute reel, And so if you wanted to basically make connections, that's quite a connection,
Yeah.
And I think also the fact that in my early career, I used a lot of animation. So you kind of basically, and going back to that idea of storyboarding, like if someone was sitting here going, Greg, do a film workshop or whatever, I would just always start with like, what if that film had to exist as a photo book, and you had 24 photos to tell that story? What would the photos be?
Yeah, actually, I remember when I learned that in analog film projection, the film actually isn't moving constantly, is it? The cell actually gets held in front of the light for a brief second before it's moved on, doesn't it?
So the film exists. If I had it in my hand, it would be a long strip of 35mm celluloid, and on that there'd be a series of small images. And if you were to run that through the projector without the tool that I'm about to explain, it would just be a big blur.
Yeah.
And so essentially, as that's going through, there's the equivalent of a fan going around in front of the lens that's basically constantly blacking out and then exposing and blacking out and exposing. And your eye registers that as a moving image.
Right. Yeah. I remember being blown away when I sort of learned that. And it's like, oh, okay, it's not just flying by at 1,000,000 miles per hour. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned a little bit about storyboarding. So do you have a process? Do you have a Greg's process for developing film concepts, and how has that process evolved over time?
When I've gone out to make a film, I've always tried to storyboard it. And I have actually sat down, like I said, I probably find a notebook behind me that's actually got the storyboards that relate to a film that I've made. And I think maybe like the Coast to Coast Trial is one of them. Can't really remember. And I've actually sat down and drawn it. And then I guess I've found that in some of my more recent films, there's a lot more people involved, and it's been a bit harder to basically be that structured and strict in terms of actually going, right, I want to get this shot.
Mm.
But at the very least, like I've alluded to, I will kind of storyboard it in the sense of like writing notes about a beginning, middle, and end. And the end result might deviate from that. But essentially, if you're out for a week on a bike with friends with a camera in your hand, you could potentially come back with an awful lot of footage.
Yeah.
And the more you do it, the better you get at realizing what you don't need to film. So quite often, like we'll be going past somewhere beautiful or whatever, and people will stop and going, assuming that I wanted to shoot it. And I'm like, no, it's not relevant. Like I don't need to film this bit, but I do need to film that bit over there of you getting off a bike or getting on a bike, or I'll stay at this shot, you guys ride off, and knowing that actually, I've got it in the bag, so then I don't need to get that again. And most of my films are a story of going from A to B, and they're mostly linear. But there are certain shots that you need, that you get, that you don't need to be linear. Like that could be any road, that could be any field, that could be any landscape. And so that once you've got those, you've got them in the bag and you can put them anywhere you want in the film. You're not really limited to making it, that was on day 2 in the afternoon. That shot could appear near the end of the film. It's fine. You got a bit of freedom there.
Where did the storyboarding discipline come from? And maybe just before you answered that question, can I ask, when you were working in London, were you working with video or film, or a mix of video and film?
So when you say film, you mean like 16 mil or something like that?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I dabbled that a little bit, but I was there at the early days. So my working career in London probably started about 2001, 2002. So technology wise, obviously I had a Super 8 camera and I have made little films on Super 8 camera, but it was at the period of kind of the PD 150. I don't know if you remember that camera. It was like a lot of the skateboarders had it. It was a DV tape with a handle on the top, flip out the side. It was before DSLRs. So you didn't really have the option to change lenses and get beautiful kind of shallow depth of field stuff. But it was very easy, shove it in someone's face. Everything's always in focus. They had a mic on them, but you could also put like a shotgun mic on and all that kind of stuff. It's a shame they've kind of fallen out of favor, but it was in that period. So that was the tool that I was using mostly, other than animation. And when you ask about where did the storyboarding come from, you make an animation, that's fundamental to the animation. It starts with you write a script, but then essentially you sit down and you draw it frame by frame. You work with the animators, work out angles. Basically, you don't want to spend a single penny animating anything that you don't need. And so basically you work really, really hard to animate and to storyboard. So the idea of storyboarding and basically the fact that everything that you shoot has a cost associated with it kind of came, I think, through my work there, you know. And if I'm out on a week and I know I come back with like 3 hours of footage, you know, you can guarantee that that's like times 10 in terms of your time in front of a computer editing it, you know. Or if you're not doing it, if you're paying for an editor, the less you can give the editor, the cheaper it's going to be, basically.
Yeah. That's exactly what I was driving at, whether this was basically a discipline that you'd picked up through your work and the cost element, particularly if you're talking about resources or employing people, but then you've just continued that discipline through with your own work in the digital video era because there are benefits to being disciplined about it as well.
Yeah. My craft at art college was processing film. So I was definitely getting into the idea of like, I've shot something and now I need to go and get it developed and then I need to pay to get it scanned. And so there was a physical cost of getting stuff done. But, you know, maybe if I was kind of 10 years older, I might have existed more. Or if I did a dedicated film course, you would probably have been encouraged to shoot on film more, you know, in terms of 16 mil and then graduating up to 35 mil. But yeah, no, I wasn't really that focused.
Yeah. I mean, do you have any view about digital versus analog?
Well, I mean, I sit in front of YouTube in the evenings and you can see the huge renaissance of film photography. You know, I was watching Grainy Days last night on YouTube, and it's all the rage, you know, to have a Leica M6 or whatever and go out and shoot stuff. And I think people are starting to kind of have that idea that when I go out and I'm talking about photography here, when I push the shutter, I've got 35 frames in a film, and that film might have cost me, I don't know what they cost now, but let's call it £10 a roll. And then I've also got to pay to get it processed and scanned. So by the time I've got a digital image in front of me, that photo itself might have cost me £3 or £4 just for one photo. Much like I've got a little Polaroid camera behind me, and you kind of, that every shot I take on that is like 80p. So like I don't give it to the kids. But it forces you to be more focused and conservative and more thoughtful about what you choose to point your lens at and what you choose to pull the shutter for, and definitely kind of associates that with a value. I think the flip side is that if you want to learn, having the freedom of digital is a wonderful tool to just basically spend 5 years learning what works and just the technical element, and then the stylistic side of what works for you and what doesn't. And, you know, I'm not saying here as a mega wealthy person, but I also I'm not a struggling student. and I still don't choose to have a film camera next to me. I would still choose to go out and have the freedom of a digital camera. So yeah, the film stuff's not that important to me anymore.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I'm glad I existed through it, and it's interesting having kids and them seeing me take photos and seeing them pick up a camera and them not having any experience of anything other than an image is free, whereas it hasn't been in the past.
I wonder if it's going to be a little bit like LPs, the renaissance of the LP. My eldest son, who's 24, I gave him my old analog camera, and he's been able to buy film for it. It's 35mm camera, and he's been taking particularly black and white photos with it. And he's like, "Oh, check this out! Look how it looks so good!" And so he's experienced a little bit of what I grew up with.
Well, he's experiencing. I mean, even 24 is like kind of older as well, but like he's experiencing, like my kids who are younger, 6 and 9, they've never really had to wait for anything. Like, oh, I want to watch this thing on the TV. Go to Netflix, find it, press play. I don't have to like go down to Blockbusters and rent the video and all the rest of it. Right through to like I want a photo, I want to see it. I guess the closest that we're getting to it in digital is that I often get my photos printed, and I have got a little kind of Canon selfie printer here, but I'll send them off, I'll upload them, and like a week later they'll arrive in the post. And it's just getting back to that sense of like, I mean, there's many things to talk about there in terms of having a physical image in your hands. That's one conversation, but in terms of like the idea of waiting for something and being patient and then being rewarded when that thing arrives, it's a nice feeling.
Absolutely. And don't get me started on a rant about the inability of young people to plan anything these days, because they've just got a phone in their pocket and they just, plans can be updated every second. Anyway, as I say, don't get me started. Just thinking broadly, do you think we see enough variety in motorcycle films and even within the subgenre of adventure ride films? And is that a challenge for you to find different storylines, to play around with different narrative structures? Do you feel constrained or what?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Like I don't sit on the board of a film festival. So I'm sure if you were like receiving lots of film submissions, you'd have a much more in-depth answer to that question. From my perspective as just a consumer of what's out there, one part of this conversation is about kind of social media, and essentially kind of you can sit here and rant and rave all you like about socials, but essentially they're a reflection of society, and the things that are popular are the things that people want to watch. You know what I mean? So all the socials and the algorithms are doing is putting a mirror back on you as a society. Therefore, the content that gets made tends to, if this formula works and you know that is going to be popular, and what you're striving for is popularity in terms of content creator, you're going to end up making content that fits that formula. And therefore, a lot of what is made becomes formulaic by the very kind of premise of entering that funnel of popularity, So I have an interesting take on this because I have a hat on from Adventure Spec, which I know this is not what this podcast is about, my Adventure Spec work, but that work is about making content. And I want our content to be seen by as many people, not as many people as possible, actually, by the right people that are potentially interested in who we are and what we do. And so I do have to be aware of the popularity aspect and how to play the game, the algorithm game. But then if I take that hat off and put like my personal hat on, is like, I want to be surprised. I want to be kind of, I wasn't expecting that. And it's a shame that stuff that is made that doesn't capture your attention in the first 3 seconds doesn't make it, or then you have to rely on other means to kind of spread the word that this thing is worth watching. And some of that stuff is really worth watching, but I don't always get to see it.
I mean, it's interesting that you bring up your Adventure Spec work, and actually, I do want to talk about your latest film a little bit later on, which is for Adventure Spec. Do you? I guess there's two things here. Which is the first thing. How do you find working in a field which is an artistic pursuit as well for you personally? And what I'm getting at here is, I guess the easiest way I can explain it is I used to work in broadcast radio, and I thought I would get into sound engineering, music sound engineering, and I never went down that path. And I was kind of glad I didn't, because I felt there was a tension between deadlines, being forced to be creative. That never sat comfortably with me. And so I guess what I'm driving at here is, how does that sit with you, that you are being paid to be creative? Or there's, because in all our jobs, there's always some pressure there. I mean, it's a kind of a healthy requirement to achieve things. But is that something that sits with you easily, or is it something that's more of a challenge?
Like anyone, any job has just days of like grind and like, oh fuck's sake, you know what I mean? Like even like, the best job in the world has elements of that. So don't ever think that I'm just kind of sitting here like in my happy place all day, every day. Like what goes out is the happy stuff, but actually there's a lot of hard work and like you say, stress underneath that. I feel very lucky to be able to kind of use my kind of creative outlet in a commercial sense, at Adventure Spec. Like the creative side of it is the best bit. It's the bit that I really, really enjoy. As any organization, we have all sorts of struggles, mostly around too much work and not enough resource. That's just like everywhere, so you can turn that around, right? And say, what if you wanted to be a full-time YouTuber? Okay. And basically your ability to pay your mortgage and put food on the table and clothes on your kids' back was entirely down to the income generated through AdSense and YouTube. And some people do that. What would life look like if that was the way that you paid the bills? And that's another way of saying like you need to be using your creativity to generate an income. I won't lie, like I thought about that and I see what other people are doing. And right now, that's not a road that I would willingly go down. That might change in the future, but adds other pressures in terms of just constantly creating content. But some of those people might have come from a life where they didn't have the ability to use their creativity from a commercial aspect, and they may be living their best lives and saying, I'm so happy, that I'm not doing that other thing and I am doing this thing that I love,
Yeah, I think the way that I sit with it comfortably now is recognizing what kind of person I am. And I like to be creative, but by goodness, I like to be creative in my own time and on my own pace. And I'm also quite happy to do something repetitive. I'm not going to say mindless, but less glamorous, to earn a crumb, but to have space in my own time to do my creative stuff. That was sort of the conclusion I came to. That's where I figured out that was what made me happy.
Oh, that's interesting. I quite enjoy a bit of a deadline and a bit of pressure. Like the most creative outlet for me on I won't say day to day, but on a weekly basis it's actually not filmmaking or photography, it's writing my email newsletters. So I have a weekly newsletter that goes out through Adventure Spec, and I actually love it. Like when we scale up and we have the resources, every email that I write is a script for a film. Like everything there could become something, be it me or someone else making it. But essentially you're going, how do I convey this story in between 60 seconds and 3 minutes, depending on how much attention people are willing to lend me, and doing it through words, occasionally some pictures, but mostly through writing. And the days or sections of my diary that I block out to write that stuff, like it forces like clarity of thought. You can't rely on some whiz bang to basically get it over the line. Like, you've only got a keyboard and you have to basically get that story, that idea, that concept out through words. And that's where everything starts for me in terms of my Adventure Spec work. The photos and going out and riding the bike and I was out last week. We've got some new gear launching next week, and we were out doing some river crossings and documenting that. I love it. That's wonderful. A lot of what I do is great. Like, I don't want anyone to sit here thinking that any of it's not all easy, but I do feel privileged that this is work,
Yeah. I think anyone who's beyond the age of 5 years old is going to know that, every job has its ups and downs for sure. And what you say about having a bit of pressure and timeline, I mean, anyone who would have seen me 2 hours ago, I mean, I had my script sort of laid out, but it was that pressure of, okay, I'm talking to Greg at 1 o'clock. I've got to have a structure around what I'm going to do here. Otherwise, it's going to fall on my face. So I'm old enough to know that I kind of like that pressure as well, because I know that it's going to force me to perform.
Well, the other bit, and I'm sure you've experienced it or talked to people, but anyone with a transmission deadline, either live or something's going out, like, I mean, I think back to when I was working and doing some work for Nickelodeon, and, it's going out on the 2nd of October. And it's like, no matter what happens, that film is going out, Yeah. And so there are two aspects of that. You stay up all night and keep your team motivated and do everything you need to do to get it done. But once it's done, it's gone. You know what I mean? No one can come back and go, oh, can you just change this? Or can we and you're like, it is done. And I was actually talking this week to someone, Alex, who's a photo retoucher, and he was doing some work for a client, and basically there was stuff being put in front of him that needed to be photographed. He had half an hour to do his thing, and then it was being put on TV. And massive pressure, but then you can come home and go, well, that's it. Wipe my hands, it's done. And that's another great bit, because in the digital world, as you know, there's always that tinkering time afterwards and the ability to keep changing stuff afterwards. It's nice to be able to just shut the door and move on to the next thing.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of recording musicians talk about that. Actually, you've got to recognize that you can't make this thing any better. You've just got to put it out there, walk away, do something else, because otherwise you will just keep tinkering forever and ever and ever.
And quite from a commercial sense, like, if it's like anywhere between 80 and 90% good, that's good enough. Like, that last 10% might make it into a work of art, but that's also where you lose all your money, because all that time doing that last little bit is like, it depends on your payment structure, but basically if there's a set amount of money, you're going to spend all your time on that last little bit.
Yeah. You incorporated what I would describe as quite a lot of fun filmmaking techniques in your early films. So I'm just going to give some examples. So lots of stop motion animation. Gee, I wonder why. And my personal favorite, actually, which was there's a sequence in the film Harvest Lanes where you've got a camera mounted very low on the bike, and as the bike goes into a river water crossing, the camera drops below the waterline, and there's a soundtrack going on in the background, and it sounds like the soundtrack's been submerged as well. Not completely, but just, it's the equalizations change. And of course, being a sound person, that appealed to me enormously. But it's sort of my perception that maybe some of that sense of fun has gone away, though not completely. I mean, you still see quite a few sort of what I would call practical elements in your titling and your map displays. But what's changed, Greg? Were those sort of techniques just too time consuming?
Yes, I have actually thought about this, and it's interesting. You're very politely framing something that's kind of, when people progress in their careers and you go out and all that energy is there in the early stuff because it was fun at that point, and then later on in your career it becomes work, and the more work it becomes, the kind of more serious it becomes. Either you feel it or I feel it's got to be more serious, or I don't have the time to do that stuff, and it just needs to be done and put out of the door. So, I mean, that is like the hardest thing, isn't it? Is to kind of like keep that early excitement and early energy and keep that kind of flowing throughout. I think as well, like in those early days, what you're seeing there, maybe not so much the audio bit, I know you've picked up on that, but things like putting a camera in fun locations and all that, some of that practical stuff like that, that's kind of what the Insta360 generation are doing now. And there's a lot more kind of tools around. Even like now that Insta360 has literally it comes with a pole and software that deletes the pole from the image. So it looks like it's floating in front of you, like the whole literally physical products are built around giving people the ability to kind of do that stuff now. And so it's become, from my perspective, a little bit more of a gimmick, which excites me less now than it maybe did in the past. I guess I'm trying to basically focus on relying a bit less on gimmicks and more on story to kind of like convey or hold people's attention. But it's a relevant point, about keeping that kind of like playful energy and like making sure it doesn't disappear.
I'd like to then pivot, because in the same, or not the same vein, but you were kind enough to share with me sort of a pre-release version of the Trans-Moroccan Trail film, which is it's a film that you've done for Adventure Spec, and it's really interesting to watch it, because I've watched obviously a lot of your material, and then to watch that film, and as you said to me, it's a film that you directed, but it's actually being largely shot by someone else and actually edited by someone else as well. So you're definitely trying something new here, because you're giving up quite a bit of, I'm not saying creative control, but you're allowing other people into the production process in a way that you have had one of your previous films, and I'll mention it, the not the NC500, that was edited by someone else. But what's it been like to give up or to share some of that production load?
So the film that is coming out this spring, depending on when you listen to this, it might already be out. It's our film of when we went to Morocco just before Christmas last year. And it's been shot and edited by Thomas Dance. I connected with Thomas maybe a couple of years ago through my shoot and ride project, and he's a very talented guy. He's actually, at the moment, he's an arborist. He's been I think he went to Glasgow Art School. Like, I watched his stuff, his other films, which have got 100 watches on YouTube. Like, he's not in any way interested in playing the game. Like, he's not in it for views. I think he'd be really happy. I think I'm not putting words in his mouth. Like, I think he'd be just as happy to basically have something seen in a film festival than have thousands of views on YouTube. I don't know. You'd have to ask him. I can set that up if you want. But this actually is relevant to what you're saying. I watched his little films of him riding around the Pyrenees, and I was like, this is different. Like, this does not feel like everything that I've seen before. This feels like if Wes Anderson was an adventure rider, this feels like the film that he would make. And I kind of, at that point, I was like, I would love to find a way to work with Thomas. I was like, my critique of the work that I'd seen was like, it looked beautiful, it felt different, felt original, but it was a bit lacking in story. And I was like, what if we could take, he can hold a camera, he can shoot a camera, he can edit, and he can ride a bike. And what if we partnered and did something together? And so that's what this Morocco film kind of became. And it's just a bit of progression, a bit of moving forwards. In my old life in London, by the end of my work, I was always collaborating with other people and bringing people in. And so I really like the idea of basically creating space to do more of that now. I know enough about myself, like I still need a camera in my hands, and I'm very happy to basically be the one taking photos, which don't always make it into the film, but they're all over the website and socials and all the rest of it. So there's still like a need for that stuff. Yeah, it was an interesting project because we'd never actually physically met until we met at the hotel airport for the flight the next morning. We'd talked on video calls, but never actually been in the same room together. So actually, being out there and filming together was the first time we had worked together. And it definitely felt in the first kind of bit of that project that we definitely didn't have our, I don't know how to say it. We didn't have our communications down. We weren't reading each other, you know?
Yeah.
I remember like being partway through that project and thinking, this is great because we're now ready for the next one, if that makes sense, you know? Like the next time we do this, we can hit the ground running. Like, you know what I'm looking for, because Thomas was also editing it. I was like, you know what I'm looking for in the edit. So you're going to know that when I say, can you get that shot? That's what we need it for, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Rather than at the time, Tom is kind of like going, why does Greg want me to shoot that? You know what I mean? But when you get to the edit, you realize. And we did quite a lot of work on prepping, and we did what I've talked about, not a physical storyboard, but basically a written kind of narrative, like for what the film would be. And then halfway through the project, it wasn't quite panning out how we'd imagined. And it was definitely like, what are we doing here? But also it was like, I am very, very busy now at work. It's not all just for fun. There's more pressures and more of a reason to do stuff. And I need to, and I want to basically bring more people in to basically collaborate with.
Right.
I'm proud of the end result of that film. It feels very, very different to what you've seen previously. Also, the dynamic in that film was different because it wasn't a bunch of guys that have known each other for years. So that was different. But yeah, it's just kind of moving forward, you know?
Yeah, and tell me about the editing process. How did that work practically? Because I'm fascinated in how things work, and I've talked to quite a few guests about this who've worked as editors, particularly. What's the relationship between the editor and the director or the producer, and how did that work in practice? Did you give an outline to Thomas? Did he go away and come back with a draft, or were you sitting over his shoulder? How did it actually happen in practice?
So on this one, we all work remotely, so we're not physically. I have done jobs in the past where I've literally sat over. That is a normal way to work, that a director will physically sit next to an editor. That wasn't the case in this one. You know, basically Thomas was generous enough because he'd not done this kind of work before. So we agreed a fee, and he was happy to put in a bit more time kind of to basically learn the job as we were doing it, as it were. So we had a bit more flexibility in terms of time. I wanted to basically be a bit hands-off to start off with and not crowd Thomas. I didn't want him to kind of feel like there was someone breathing over his neck. So initially it was like, okay, go away, take what we talked about at the start, use what we've got and see what comes back. And so there was an initial edit, and it quickly became apparent that there was some like beautiful visuals, stuff looked great, you know, but at that stage the story was kind of not quite there yet. There was no voiceover. I hadn't done any voiceover at that stage. It was just see what would come back naturally with Thomas's approach. And then we kind of discussed that a bit, and we bounced ideas backwards and forwards. And there was I know for me personally, there was a moment in those early kind of discussions and edits that I was like, well, maybe it's not going to work. And then we basically started refining it and understanding, kind of simplifying the story and not trying to fight and make it something that we wanted it to be, and allowing it to be what it was, if that made sense, and being a bit more authentic with it.
Yeah. And
then I think the key bit was when I sat down and wrote the voiceover script, because basically a voiceover, and I specifically take these words from Ollie Moto, who made a great film in the Himalayas. I heard him being interviewed about it, and he's basically saying like a voiceover is kind of like a get out of jail free card, if that makes sense. So what the voiceover allows you to do is basically convey stuff that needs conveyed that wasn't captured at the moment. And so once I started doing that, it allowed me to kind of fill in a few gaps and also relieve Thomas's editing pressure of making something say something that wasn't quite there with the tools or the material he had to work with.
Yeah.
And so you end up doing this like kind of little dance where you've got the edit in front of you and you can do a voiceover that is talking about what someone is seeing, which basically adds a layer. But then you can also add a voiceover that cues up the next bit, if that makes sense, and joins bits together.
I want to come back and talk a little bit about the voiceover in a minute, but just before I forget, one of the things that's also noticeable, and of course you actually bring attention to it in the voiceover, is that you had the benefit of a third vehicle, basically a filming platform, a four-wheeled vehicle, chase car, whatever you want to call it, that was driving along with you. And that, I don't think you've ever had that before in anything you've made, at least in the adventure ride films. Of course, you've had the drone, which arguably is a little bit similar, but it's not quite the same. Just explain to me what you feel the benefit of having that, or expand on what you said in the film, the benefit of having that chase vehicle and what it meant in terms of what it offered.
There's a real tension there. So here I am putting this project together. This is the first time that we've really gone out and spent some proper Adventure Spec money, So a lot of my other films have been, Adventure Spec have supplied kit and stuff, but really it's a bunch of guys going off and having a fun holiday together and then documenting that. Whereas this was like, okay, some proper money's getting spent here, paying for everyone to fly out and all the rest of it. So having the support vehicle was kind of me playing it safe and basically going, right, okay, if we've got that vehicle, if something goes wrong or someone gets hurt, the whole thing doesn't have to end. I'm also there all of a sudden, like responsible for other people's safety and all the rest of it. Really, we did this again and we're going to do the same thing. We would have a producer and take some of that pressure off me. But yeah, so the support vehicle was kind of me playing it safe. Well, if we were going to do it again, I think we could do that project again without a support vehicle and it would have a different vibe in that you're all like self-supported. We'd also kind of do the whole thing a little bit more self-supported and maybe not have a guide and all the rest of it. But because I'd not done it before, I played it safe. I had a support vehicle. We partnered with Sam at Wilderness Wheels. And basically, I did everything I could do to make sure that when we were on the plane back, I had a hard drive full of media that we could use, if that makes sense. So it was like less of a risk. So there was definitely like a commercial element there. Basically, you're not allowed to fly drones in Morocco. The chances are you'll have your drone confiscated off you at the airport. They do kind of check for that. It's quite locked down from a military perspective. Some people do smuggle them in and you can get around it, but I was like, hey, we'll just live without a drone. Having the vehicle there was really handy to be able to have someone in the vehicle shooting out of the side of the vehicle. So we all had intercoms on and I had an open face helmet and I left my helmet on. So I'd be like leaning out of the side of the window while the guys were sort of riding alongside. And I'd be basically saying, oh, okay, right, Jim, you come up, I'm going to shoot you now. And so I was doing that for photographs and then we would stop and we would swap and Tom would get in and he would shoot his video elements of that. One of the big things that we have got coming up is that the new gear that was used in that Morocco film, which is launching this kind of spring, summer, is we want to tell a story that it's suitable for adventure road riding as well as off-road riding. So I really had it in my head that I had to come back with material that showed that gear being used on the road, because everyone knows Adventure Spec as off-road stuff, but the stuff that we make is CE AA certified, so it is suitable for road use. And so that's part of the story that I really wanted to focus on. So again, having that support vehicle, and basically you can, if you didn't have that, your options are You can have someone stood still and you can photograph and film them while they're stood still. They can ride past you, and you basically you do that like 4 or 5 times and get the shot. But it's really, really hard to get that shot of people riding naturally, if that makes sense.
And yet I think it's so compelling to the eye because, and this is something I talked about first with Brent Pearson, one of my earlier guests, because he and I were totally on the same page. There's something extremely compelling about watching someone ride a bike very close.
Yeah.
And it looks so good. And you can't, I mean, he does it with a chin mount, following someone. But there's something really cool if you can actually get a side-on view, as you do in the film, because of the advantage of having the chase vehicle there. So it just, I think it really works visually.
It's odd, isn't it? You just mentioned like he does it with like a chin mount. Like you can do it with a GoPro. Like I quite often will ride along one-handed with my GoPro in the other hand, and I'll hold it out. And you can get that stuff. Insta360, as we've talked about, is built for that shot. But once you make the decision to step up and use kit that's a step above the GoPro, it makes it really, really. I mean, what we learned on this trip is we didn't take for Tom's video camera, which is a small Sony thing. We didn't take a gimbal, like a stabilizing unit, and we should have done. If we did it again, we even in the car, it was still too bumpy. And actually, the interesting thing is the shots in the film that are treated to look like Super 8 or Super 16.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that was like a creative tool to get around the fact that they were really badly wobbling, like shot. But once you make that transition, like they look wonderful. They have a real film of like, people would go, "Oh, did you take a film camera with you?" You know what I mean? But we didn't.
I had to laugh because I went to the Dakar film that Break Magazine put on at the bike shed around Christmas time.
Yeah.
And before that, I watched on really shitty, grainy YouTube videos like 360p, whatever it was, the race to Dakar. And watching those shots, I thought, oh, I know what you guys are trying to do here. You're trying to make it look like those race to, because those race to Dakar shots, a lot of them are just terrible. There's just dust everywhere. And then you bring that down to 360p on YouTube and it just looks awful. But yeah, I did note that, but it's funny. Yeah, you were kind of a little bit forced to doing that, but it looks good though, and it gives that vibe of that sort of an older period.
Yeah. I mean, like Thomas's filmmaking style is very. I hope that when you watch it, you get a sense like there's something. There is a style. You know what I mean? Like that. It's this is the thing. Is like. You've got people such as, including myself, that go out and make GoPro-based films, and there's that. And then there's people that have made a big step forwards and are trying to make or are making films that almost look cinematic, like they were made to be in the cinema as a movie. Tripods locked off, beautiful, shallow depth of field. Everything's like really thought about and perfect, slow pans, whatever, and they're interested in the professionalism of it. And like, I think Thomas's is somewhere in between, right. It feels a step up from a GoPro, but what I hope it is that it hasn't gone so far that it loses that, like, not authenticity. That's not quite the right word, but rawness, like Gonzo-esque, if that makes sense,
Yeah, no, I think I know exactly what you mean, because you can see some films that are spectacular, but they sort of ooze money and they lack a bit of soul for that reason. Yeah. I want to come back to an aspect that we were talking about, which is the voiceover. But the way I want to come into it is that I'm pretty sure in one of your earlier films, and I'm talking way back, you state that you're pretty unenthusiastic about speaking to camera. You've obviously overcome that. So how did you overcome that initial hesitancy of speaking to camera?
I have no way to answer that question. Like, I'm surprised that I've even said that at some point, but, if I'm going to sit here and be honest about like a reflection of my work and my craft, like feel very comfortable now. Like like talking to you here, like having a camera in front of my face, you know, I haven't sat down in front of a mirror and gone, right, let's work on this. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I guess it is like I've just done it lots and lots. It's funny, like I do quite a lot of product films on Adventure Spec where it's me sat in this studio, it's set up differently, it's a white background, whatever, and I'm talking about the gravel jacket and pant, and I'll literally talk for like an hour and a half about this product. That's a solo production. There's no one else in the room when I'm doing that. The way that I'd make those films is I'll get my Premiere project open and I'll drop into my timeline the clips that I'm going to talk about. So it's like, here's a photo of the cuffs on the jacket, whatever. And then here's a shot of Davy riding in Scotland. And in between those, basically, I kind of like, again, I'm storyboarding on the timeline. I'm writing the notes for what I want to say, but I'm not writing a script. So I'm basically going, like, in this section, we're going to talk about this particular feature. And then I've got my timeline on the computer in front of me and the camera in front of me, and I'm talking, and I'm basically just going, oh yeah, this was Davy in Scotland. We went and found this beach, and we'd been riding through the rain all day, and then the sun came out, and we found, and basically trying to relive like a truthful moment and genuinely help people understand how that bit of gear performed in that lived experience. Do you know, like, I'm not sitting here like making stuff up out. We went and did this and I'm telling you about it, and then connect that with, and it's a 1000D fabric, which is 1000 denier fabric, and then explain about what that means. But in reality, like what you see is a really neat and concise edited version. Like I do those little sections, I'll fluff my lines. I'm like, oh, I said that wrong. Blah, blah, blah. Right, go back. Slap myself in the face. Say it again, you know? And then because I have the ability to re-edit it, I do re-edit it. Like instead of talking to you in this podcast, if I would sat down with a microphone on my own and said, I'm going to have an hour and a half of Greg talking, I would do the same thing. I would re-say stuff. You know what I mean? It's different when you do it live with a person, as opposed to kind of doing it yourself. But what I'm kind of answering your question in that, like, I do it a lot, if that makes sense.
Right. Okay. So now bringing it back to the Trans-Morocco Trail film. Now, feel free to correct me if I've got this wrong, but my impression is that you've employed the voiceover narration more than ever before. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, it is. Basically, I started using it more. I don't really know what that means. I've used other techniques, like in the Coast to Coast trial, there wasn't a voiceover. In fact, there was no recorded audio at all, because basically I think I shot that on a Canon 5D Mark II, and I didn't have any audio. Basically, adding audio recording on that camera on the fly was just too problematic. So it was just music, and then I used text on screen. So here's the thing, like I quite often use, maybe because I've got a graphic design background as well or something like that, but basically a more general communications background, there are tools that you can use to convey a story that aren't just someone talking to a camera or a camera filming something. Maybe that comes from that like animation background as well, I don't know, but there are other ways of doing it. I've used the voiceover in, I can't remember. Did I use the voiceover in the Spain film? Yeah, I used the voiceover in the Spain film. Maybe I did one before that, I can't remember. And it just seems to have worked, and so I've kind of just used it more. I think, like I said, it gives a bit more flexibility to kind of steer the story, especially when it feels like there's more of a, I don't know if this is pressure, but there's more of a need to tell a story rather than just, this is just for fun. Let's see what happens. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, it's like, okay, if this film doesn't really hit the mark, like, then it's not really doing its job. You know, there's more of a need now for the films to do the job. It may be that if I went out and made something for fun tomorrow, it would feel quite different, maybe quite artsy. I don't know. I think the other element of this which is a tangent, is just more generally what is made for work and what is made for pleasure. And the stuff that I do for pleasure now, I don't care who sees it or how many likes it gets or whatever. I've kind of, having had a period where I've not really posted anything for quite a while, and I've had some time away from that. I feel like I've severed that link between happiness and likes, if you want to be as simple as that,
Yeah.
And actually, for my own personal stuff that I'm proud of, I'm happy that I'm out using my camera or editing a photo, and the act of doing that is where the joy is, not the how it's received.
Yep.
With my work hat on, I really want that stuff to be received well and ultimately drive people towards Adventure Spec and help them discover what we do. From a personal level, because I've got two hats on, it allows, I think, maybe that happens over there with work, which means it doesn't have to happen over here for fun, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I said before in other episodes that I'm quite a recent convert to the voiceover, and actually I've become quite a big fan of it, to be honest. I mean, for the Trans Morocco Trail film, did you have a written script, or were you off the cuff when you were recording the voiceover?
So written script is helpful for clarity of thought and what you're trying to say. Quite often when it comes down to it, I'll either have that in front of me and glance at it, or I'll strip it out into bullet points of this is the points I want to make. So on the Trans Morocco film, the initial voiceover was always intended to be like a holding, like we hadn't done it before. Like it was in that kind of collaboration phase with Thomas where we were just finding our flow. And I was like, okay, let me send you a voiceover and see if it changes things, And so I had a setup similar to this, but I wasn't really checking my levels or whatever. I just did it, and we put it on and it worked, and it stayed there for all of the edits. And then towards the end, it became apparent that the quality of recording wasn't what we needed it to be. And so then I went back and revoiced it over, and it was really hard to revoice it in exactly the same words, intonation, emphasis as the original. So yeah. I just ended up doing lots of different versions, and gave myself the flexibility. As long as the original was 12 seconds and this is the point it makes, as long as this one is ballpark 12 seconds and makes the point, it doesn't really matter if it's not exactly the same words, and gave myself a bit more flexibility that way. So I think I can read a script fairly authentically. I read to my kids every other night. Me and Georgia take turns. So I'm now almost a decade into reading stories out loud. And funnily enough, I think that actually does train you quite well, reading stories. But so I can read a script, but I prefer to basically see what naturally comes out.
Yeah, it's that lift you get from performance that comes from the spontaneous sort of performance. Yeah. I'm getting towards the end, but I just want to ask you a little thing, which is not exactly related to filmmaking, but it is related to writing, which is that in many of your adventure ride or adventure trip films, you push a message at the end about, okay, for want of a better word, ethical riding, which I think can be summed up as being very respectful for the use of particularly the green lanes in the UK, and also following sort of the code of conduct or whatever it's called when riding on the Trans-European Trail in Europe. That seems to me to be very important to you. Maybe can you just explain why you believe it's so important?
Yeah, I got a funny little anecdote on this. So when I first started trail riding, so buy a bike, don't know anything about trail riding, don't know anything about green laning or anything like that. I've been a fairly avid hiker in the past. So the idea of the difference between footpaths and bridleways and following routes on OS maps, I'm familiar with. You buy a bike. This is whatever, 13, 14 years ago now. Buy the bike, and then you suddenly realize, where can we ride? And this is before the online resources like the TET existed. So I joined my local TRF, Trail Riders Fellowship Club. Facebook existed, but it wasn't used properly. So like you'd go down to the club meets. So basically the only real way to connect with that community was physically be in the room with them once a month. I remember there was if you wanted to get out as a ride, there was a phone number for a mobile phone. It was like a bat phone, and you'd text that, and then someone in the club secretary would try and connect you with someone else. It's mad, like that. It almost feels like yesterday, but also so much has changed since then. And this is relevant to what I'm going to say. So there's a route up here, which is a fantastic route. You've got a lot of freedom about where you go. It's muddy, all the rest of it. And I remember there was a Facebook group set up for Northumbria TRF, and I remember posting some photos of me and friends going up and basically covered in mud, having a blast. Like the photos looked really epic. It looked amazing. And I remember being at the next club meet, kind of expecting to be met with like pats on back. Like, that was an amazing photo. That looks so good, and just getting absolutely ripped like by the elders, this will be the death of trail riding in Northumberland. Like if photos like this go out into the wider public, like it will bring so much unwanted attention and negativity to what we do. And that was a real wake-up call about like the responsibility side, like partly about whether or not I should be riding that route in winter, but also like understanding the impact, good and bad, that media can have. And now we're all self-publishing people, and we all have the ability to go out and show the world what we've done like earlier that day and post it publicly. And there is a huge amount of sensitivity around what we can ride and what we can't ride. And we are always under threat. And I am not trying to tell people what they should do. I'm trying to say to people, be mindful about what you put out there in the world, and good and bad, you can have an impact, and so something that's more important to me personally, I'm now in a position at Adventure Spec where I am helping to steer the ship, so I am able to influence the company and align it with my values, and those are my values. So the content that we're putting out there, I try to basically have an element of being responsible and thoughtful about what we do and how we present ourselves to the world. And there are real tensions with that, like I'm going to simplify things here a little bit, but in America, you can go out and ride for 2 days and not see anyone in the middle of the desert. If you want to basically post content of you doing a wheelie and tearing up, whatever, my opinion, with my simplified opinion, is no one cares, over there. And so therefore, for businesses that are basically trading on the back of that kind of content, it's quite exciting. Do you know what I mean? You can put that exciting stuff out there. But actually, over here in Northern Europe, or most of Europe, like you can't trade on that. Like, or if you do choose to trade on that, you've got to really ask yourself, like, how sustainable that really is, And, we see big bike manufacturers trading on the back of kind of media that shows stunt riders doing kind of amazing wheelies and jumps and riding aggressively on trails in the same sentence as go out and have an adventure on the TET. And you're like wonderful, that's helping you sell bikes, but that is not helping the TET exist into the future. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you're telling people that that's okay behavior, so there's a real tension, because, I get it. It's that media grabs my attention much more than someone pootling around really slowly and being really boring. Do you know what I mean? So it's about finding that middle ground, I think.
Yeah. And of course, for those people who are not aware of the trails and the green lanes in the UK, they're open to everyone. So you will come across cyclists, walkers, and even horses on those tracks
Yeah.
quite legitimately. So it's a shared space, yeah?
Essentially, there's a hierarchy of trails, and you've got footpaths that are only for walkers. So you can't go on a footpath if you're on a horse or on a bike, bicycle, or a motorized vehicle. And then you've got a bridle way, which you can walk on, cycle on, or take a horse down, but you can't take a motorized vehicle down. And then you've got a byway open to traffic, which is essentially got a legal classification as a road, even though when you're on it, it may not look or feel like a road. It's not got any tarmac on it. It might be very narrow. In history, that was a road to help people go from one place to another place, horse and cart, whatever. And so therefore it still retains that legal classification. So therefore you can ride a motorcycle or a car down it with the same scrutiny as if you were riding down a regular road. You need tax, MOT, speed limits, all the rest of it. However, access to those roads, there's not a lot of access. There's not many of them left. And they are always under pressure to be closed down because people don't necessarily want vehicles going down them. So there are organizations here in the UK, like the Trail Riders Fellowship, that exist to kind of fight legal battles to keep those roads open. But we all have a kind of joint responsibility, I think, to basically, if we want to keep doing it, play our part.
Yeah. Okay, a couple of last questions. And maybe I should have preempted you on the first one because it's maybe a bit tough, so don't panic. But what other filmmakers, or if you do actually watch things on YouTube, do you take inspiration from for your own filmmaking?
There's people in the world that exist in that I watch their trajectory, and I'm really happy to see them kind of moving forward. So, I mean, you've interviewed someone like Thomas Hansen's, like, really progressed, Robert Baldinger, and kind of creating their YouTube channels. Kind of got my work hat on with that. The interesting thing is they're all progressing in slightly different ways. You know, like I can see Thomas is like really doubling down on the technical elements, you know, and then Robert is kind of really doubling down on the presenter elements, you know. Being really honest, because this is my work, like I don't really sit down in the evenings and watch a lot of that stuff. Like I do see it, and when I see something that I like, I'll save it and I'll put it out on the radar newsletter that I put out through Adventure Spec. The stuff that I watch kind of take my mind off work, but stay within photography is really like it's a lot of like street photography stuff. So I've kind of taken to getting my camera and going out into Newcastle and just shoot street photography, nothing to do with bikes, you know. It's like also like street photography is really, really hard. Like 99.9% of what you shoot is utter shite. Like it's so bad, which means that when you get a good one, you're really happy, you know. But it's fun to be back in a world of not being very good at something and having to work hard to learn it and do it for fun. You know, and just developing a style over there, you know, it's kind of scary putting your camera in front of a stranger's face, you know, and it really, like, you got to work on how close you want to be, what lens you've got, what kind of photo you want to get. And so I watch a lot of, like, there's Grainy Days. I really like his stuff. Like, you watch his stuff and he basically talks about his photos and he's like, they're all rubbish, but he does it in an amusing way. Yeah. And his films are like an hour and a half long of him kind of podcast style talking to a microphone and then cutting away to show him out being on a street or wherever it is that he's shooting, and then cuts to his photos. I mean, he's got a lot of followers, and for some reason, like, it's really relaxing and compelling. And that's long form, you know, like, which is kind of the opposite of what you would expect. So yeah, I've enjoyed his stuff. There's a documentary series called Wrong Side of the Lens. There's maybe like half a dozen or so street photographers that they've made documentary films about. I really enjoyed that. I really, really enjoyed that. And then there's a great series on National Geographic just called Photographer. And that's basically following some National Geographic photographers, from studio guys to nature guys to documentary guys and girls, and that's that was really enjoyable. So yeah, I mean, I guess you're kind of like asking in some ways like who should you maybe interview next. I'd have to have a think about that, you know. And then like there's Thomas Dance, like, who has got 5 followers on YouTube and 3 films, and he is the person that I chose to bring in to work with, because I just really loved, there was just something so like different and wasn't trying hard to be something. It was just, his little films were just beautiful, you know, and I really feel like they deserve to be seen more, but he's pretty happy just cutting trees. You know?
Well, from what you've said, that sounds like right up my alley, because I really don't care about how many subscribers or views people have. I'm more interested in if they're interested in talking about it and if they're doing something a little bit different. And yeah. Okay, my final question, my famous final question. And from your own personal experience, does the filmmaking enhance or diminish the pleasure of a motorcycle ride?
I mean, I can really easy. I've got the answer. Just comes off, like I've said it so many times. You know, like for me, going riding without a camera is like going fishing without a fishing rod. You know, like the camera is my fishing rod, and coming back with photos is coming back with fish. You know, and if I come back with one good photo that I'm like, yeah, that was the photo, that's like coming back with a beautiful trout or something, you know. And quite often you might just come back with a load of little minnows and you're like, okay, whatever, you know. But yeah, so for me, kind of photography and adventure motorcycling, like they can't even be separated. They're so intertwined. And I find it not impossible, but I find it really hard to go out without my camera, you know. Occasionally I do. I've got to test some new gear and I'll just go out and have a ride and get a feel for it. And sometimes it is a bit liberating, you know. You're like, oh, I didn't have to stop and whatever. But, you know, you always feel like, yeah, if I don't have the camera there, you're like, well, what if this amazing thing happens in front of me and I can't, you know, shoot it? Or what if there's an amazing sunset, or, you know, the sky breaks and there's a shaft of light coming through or whatever, you know, like, so. But there was a phase like after lockdown where we were all in the headspace of riding or being on our own, and when I look back at my hard drives and stuff, there's a lot of the stuff there was me going somewhere and walking away from the bike, turning around and shooting the bike in a beautiful location. So there's lots of those photos at that stage, and the relationship between camera, bike, and landscape existed in the context of what I've just described. Right now, like, I work from home, got a busy family life, like it's quite lonely in this existence. Like, I got asked this question on another podcast, and the question was like, what do you always take with you? What 3 things do you always take with you? And I was like, well, I'll take my camera, I'll take my Adventure Spec gear, and then the third thing was like a friend. Like, and like right now, the tick box of like the dream scenario is those things, you know. I want to go out and use my bike and my camera as tools to spend time with friends, you know. So actually, interestingly, Chris, who works with me, he lives down the road and he works a lot on, he's in a lot of the Adventure Spec photos. He's kind of my model. He's also a photographer. We went out over Christmas and it was cold and icy. I fell off my bike within like a mile. So we came back and we just went into town and did a load of street photography together. And I was like, this is just as good. Like, I'm hanging out with my mate, I'm chatting away, we've got cameras in our hands and we're enjoying the process of fishing, you know, just in a different lake, if that makes sense, you know. So yeah.
Thanks so much for being my guest for this episode, Greg. Perhaps you can tell listeners where they can find your work online.
So I'm aware everyone's busy. If there's only one thing you do on the back of this, because you want to be part of this longer conversation, subscribe to the Adventure Spec newsletter. That is the thing that I am regularly most excited by and gets a lot of my attention. So if you've enjoyed anything of what I've said and you want to be part of that conversation, that's a really good place to start. Obviously, that's with a workout on, so it's about Adventure Spec stuff, but it's me kind of telling the story on a weekly basis. Other than that, you can hunt around YouTube for, various things that I've done for myself and Adventure Spec. If you like the photography side of it, my personal website, gregvillalobos.co.uk, gets a lot more of my attention than any socials or anything like that. So everything that I'm most proud of goes on there. And yeah, you can follow me on socials and stuff but the Adventure Spec channel gets updated a lot. My personal stuff less so. But yeah. And then you mentioned Shoot and Ride, which was a project that was running for a little while, but I've just had to park it because life is just too busy. But there's, if you go to my website, you can find the Shoot and Ride stuff as well. But you can get me in your inbox weekly via that Adventure Spec newsletter.
Thanks again. I look forward to seeing more of your adventure films. Naturally, please take care and ride safe.
Yeah, thanks, Simon.